Hello, guys, and welcome to Atlas Canada, the show where we talk about Canadian geography and essentially discover this beautiful country that I call home. Now, did you know that Canada actually produces 71% of all maple products in the world? In fact, there are only two nations that actually produce maple syrup, and that is Canada and the United States. So basically, guys, in today's episode, we'll be discovering why is Canada such a dominant force in this industry, and how has maple syrup become such a symbol associated with Canada? Unsurprisingly, this dominance is due to geography, and more specifically, it's due to the climate of Eastern Canada. And this climate is also found in northeastern United States, so in New England, especially in the states of Maine, Vermont, and New Hampshire. As you can see from this map here, in red are the areas suitable for maple syrup production. So it's a rather large area stretching from Atlantic Canada, going as east as southern Ontario, and going as south as the Appalachian states in the United States. However, maple syrup production is very much concentrated in this circle around Quebec here. In Canada, there's actually only 3 provinces that have a significant production level, and that is Quebec, which produces actually 92% of all Canadian maple syrup. So that's an insane amount. It's followed by New Brunswick that has 4% production, and then finally Ontario with 3%. The remaining of the Canadian production is shared between Nova Scotia and some western provinces. However, their production level is rather insignificant compared to Quebec and New Brunswick. In total, Canada actually produces 60 million liters of maple syrup per year, which has been steadily increasing since the French settlers arrived. However, this has been especially rising since the 1990s when the industry essentially saw a large boom in Canada. However, French settlers were not the first to discover maple syrup, and far from it. That title actually belongs to the Aboriginals of Eastern Canada, such as the Haudenosaunee, the Mi'kmaq, and the Algonquins, who had been using maple syrup for hundreds of years before European settlement. Now, just a side note, I am very sorry for the butchering of those words. However, they're hard to say, and yeah. Now, they noticed that maple trees would actually produce this sugary sap that could be extracted during spring, and they would use this as a preservatives on meats, especially during winter time while food was scarce. Now, at the arrival of the French settlers in the 1700s, the Aboriginals actually taught the French settlers how to make maple syrup, and this is how the whole Canadian industry began. Now, the process of extracting maple syrup is kind of a complicated one. I won't go into details, but something that is important to mention is that a maple tree only starts producing maple syrup when it is around 30 to 40 years old, and a typical tree only produces 35 to 50 liters per spring. Now, typically maple syrup is produced at what we call a cabane à sucre. Essentially, it's a large area with a lot of maple trees, and there's a cabin in the middle. Now, every tree is tapped, and those taps are connected by tubes that bring the maple syrup all the way to the main cabin. Once it's at the main cabin, it is extensively boiled, and the remnants of that boiling is maple syrup, and that's how you get maple syrup. Now, in the past, they would actually use metal buckets instead of tubes. Tubes are kind of a modern invention nowadays, and it is essentially transported by pumps. However, in the olden days, they didn't have that, so you'd have a normal bucket and you'd have to transport it by hand all the way to the main cabin. So it is now a process that is much easier. Now, we have to understand, why is this geographic location the only place on earth where maple syrup can be naturally produced? We have to understand also that not all maple trees can actually produce maple syrup. The sap is only produced when there is a cold climate during winter and a warm climate during summer. So there needs to be a large temperature variations between seasons, essentially. And this presence of the specific climate and the actual maple trees is only found in Eastern Canada and northeastern United States. There is no other places on earth where this combination actually exists. So this is why this region produces all the maple syrup in the world. Now, what does Canada do with all this maple syrup? Well, obviously, Canadians can't consume all of the Canadian production because it's an insane amount, and Canada has a rather small population, so most of it is actually exported to the world. And surprisingly enough, the United States is the largest importer of Canadian maple syrup. Now, yes, the United States is a producer. However, they have a rather large population, and a lot of them love maple syrup. So a lot of Canadian maple syrup actually gets brought to the United States. Now, other big importers of Canadian maple syrup are European countries, such as Germany and France and the UK. And another large importer is actually Japan, which was kind of surprising. Canada, and more specifically Quebec, actually also stockpiles their maple syrup. So they put them in these large barrels, oil barrels, and they're essentially stockpiled in a warehouse. And this is actually worth an estimated amount around 230 million Canadian dollars. And surprisingly, in the past, there's actually been people trying to heist or steal this maple syrup, which is a very unique way to make some cash, honestly. In conclusion, guys, Canada will likely continue to dominate this industry. It has seen a record production level in 2019 and has seen a surge in production in every province, especially in New Brunswick, where they've seen a production increase of 65%. The United States is still well behind in terms of production compared to Canada. And you know what? The maple, it's a Canadian symbol. So Canada has to stay on top of this industry in order to keep making Canadians proud of their maple syrup. So with that said, guys, I hope you guys enjoyed this video on maple syrup production. I hope you guys learned something new about maple syrup. And don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Ciao, guys.